Picture a young girl without parents, ripped away from all she had ever known, thrust into the harem of a king ruling the mightiest empire the world had seen. Now, picture that very same girl, years down the road, standing before a royal throne where a single misstep could mean immediate execution, clutching the destiny of her entire people in her trembling hands. This isn't some make-believe fairy tale. This is the Book of Esther, and it's far more perilous, strategic, and heart-stopping than anyone ever told you. In the darkened corridors of the Persian Empire, a mass extermination was being orchestrated, a royal edict stamped with the king's seal, unchangeable, unstoppable, absolute. An entire population targeted for annihilation on one predetermined day. The Jewish people possessed no military, no nation to call their own, no political power whatsoever. Their only chance rested with a hidden queen who had concealed her true heritage. A woman the king hadn't requested in 30 days, poised on the precipice of a choice that would either rescue millions or strip her of everything she held dear. This is a narrative of insurmountable challenges, of hatred stretching back through time, of a reversal so staggering it seems beyond imagination. No supernatural interventions, no prophetic voices, only bravery, precision, timing, and a haunting question reverberating through the ages. Who can say whether you haven't arrived at royalty precisely for a moment like this? Our narrative opens in the 3rd year of King Xerxes' rule, when he occupied his throne in the fortress city of Susa. This wasn't simply another kingdom. His domain spanned 127 provinces, reaching from India clear across to Ethiopia. Xerxes ranked among the most commanding rulers alive, and he intended the entire world to recognize it. Chapter 1. Verse 3 reveals that the king hosted an elaborate banquet for every noble and official under his command. Military commanders from Persia and Media attended alongside provincial princes and aristocrats. But calling this a simple dinner gathering would be misleading. The 4th verse explains that this exhibition of prosperity and grandeur continued for 180 days, a complete half-year. Day after relentless day, Xerxes flaunted the treasures of his royal magnificence and the splendor of his supreme majesty. Once those 6 months concluded, the king organized yet another celebration. The 5th verse describes how this particular feast lasted 7 full days, held within the enclosed gardens of the royal palace. This occasion welcomed everyone dwelling in the citadel of Susa, from the most distinguished to the most ordinary citizens. White and blue fabric hangings adorned the garden, secured by cords of premium linen and purple cloth attached to silver rings mounted on marble columns. Golden and silver couches rested upon mosaic floors, crafted from stones of varying colors. The 7th verse depicts wine being served in golden goblets, each vessel uniquely different from all the others, and the royal wine poured freely thanks to the king's generous spirit. The drinking policy was straightforward. As the 8th verse clarifies, nobody was forced to consume alcohol. Every guest could drink as abundantly or as sparingly as they preferred. While the king feasted alongside the men, verse 9 informs us that Queen Vashti hosted a separate banquet for the women inside the royal palace. The atmosphere seemed flawless. The empire was celebrating its dominance and riches. But then an unexpected event occurred that caught everyone off guard. On that 7th feast day, when King Xerxes' spirits were elevated from wine, the 10th verse records that he ordered 7 eunuchs serving under him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zetar, and Carcas, to escort Queen Vashti into his presence. The 11th verse clarifies his motivation. He desired to display her beauty before the assembled people and nobles, because she possessed remarkable looks. She was meant to appear wearing her royal crown so all could witness how stunning his queen truly was. But the 12th verse delivers an astonishing revelation. When the attendants conveyed the king's directive, Queen Vashti declined to come. She simply refused. The text offers no explanation for her refusal, but the consequence was unmistakable. The king's fury ignited, his rage burned hot within him. The king required counsel. Verse 13 explains, it was his established practice to seek guidance from authorities on legal and judicial matters. Therefore, he consulted wise advisors who possessed understanding of current affairs. The 14th verse identifies them: Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan. These 7 nobles enjoyed privileged access to the king and occupied the most prestigious positions throughout the kingdom. Verse 15 captures the king's inquiry. According to our laws, what action must be taken against Queen Vashti? She has disobeyed the command King Xerxes transmitted through the eunuchs. Memucan stepped forward to respond. His answer in verses 16 through 18 unveils something significant. This situation transcended the king's damaged pride. Memucan declared that Queen Vashti had committed an offense not solely against the king, but against every noble and every population throughout all the provinces. He reasoned that when women across the empire learned what the queen had done, they would begin treating their own husbands with contempt. The noble women of Persia and Media who discovered the queen's actions would mirror this behavior toward all the king's nobles, creating endless disrespect and conflict. Memucan's proposed remedy was drastic. In verses 19 and 20, he recommended that, if it pleased the king, a royal proclamation should be issued and inscribed into the unchangeable laws of Persia and Media. Vashti must never again be permitted into King Xerxes' presence. The king should transfer her royal standing to someone superior to her. When this edict was announced throughout the enormous realm, every woman would show proper respect to their husbands, from the most humble to the most powerful. The 21st verse states that the king and his nobles approved this recommendation. Verse 22 describes how he dispatched official communications to every section of the kingdom, to each province in its native script, and to each population group in their native tongue, declaring that every man must rule as master in his own household. The queen's act of refusal had stripped her of everything. The seat beside the most dominant man in the empire now sat empty, and that vacant throne would shortly be occupied by someone nobody anticipated, a Jewish orphan girl concealing herself in plain view. Time moved forward, and the king's anger subsided. Chapter 2, verse 1 relates that afterward, when King Xerxes' rage had diminished, he thought back on Vashti and what she had done and what he had officially decreed concerning her. Perhaps regret touched him regarding his severe judgment, but the law remained unchangeable. What had been established was permanent. The king's personal servants recognized an opening. The 2nd verse records their proposal. Let a search be conducted for beautiful young virgins suitable for the king. They had devised a strategy. Verse 3 elaborates that the king should designate commissioners throughout every province in his domain to gather all these beautiful young women to the harem located at the citadel of Susa. They would be entrusted to Hegai, the king's eunuch responsible for the women, and beauty preparations would be administered to them. The 4th verse completes their suggestion. Then allow the young woman who delights the king to become queen in Vashti's place. This proposal satisfied the king, and he implemented it as they recommended. This initiated the search process. But understand clearly, this bore no resemblance to a romantic fairy tale. These were young virgins being removed from their homes and families across the entire empire. Each would undergo 12 months of beauty preparation and then share one night with the king. Most would never encounter him again afterward. They would live out their remaining years in a secondary harem, holding status as neither wife nor free woman. Only one would ascend to queen. The empire's apparatus turned into motion, and commissioners traveled throughout the 127 provinces seeking beautiful young women. They weren't requesting family permission. They were taking these girls by the king's supreme authority. Each young woman brought to Susa confronted the identical uncertain future, a year of intensive preparation, one night with the king, and then a lifetime of waiting. The palace harem started filling with young women from across the empire. Some originated from wealthy backgrounds, others from impoverished circumstances. Some were Persian, others came from the kingdom's distant edges. Each had been selected based on appearance, not character or personal aspirations. They were being prepared like ritual offerings, groomed and refined according to Persian beauty standards. Among all these young women transported to Susa, one would alter the trajectory of history. But she hadn't volunteered for this path. She hadn't requested any of it. She was simply caught up in the king's search operation, one more beautiful young virgin taken to the citadel to join the others in the harem. Her name was Hadassah, though shortly everyone would recognize her by a different name. Chapter 2, verse 5, introduces us to a man residing in the citadel of Susa. His name was Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. He belonged to the tribe of Benjamin, and his ancestral history held importance. Verse 6 clarifies that Kish had been transported into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those captured alongside Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai's family had lived in Persia for multiple generations, exiles distant from their ancestral homeland. But Mordecai wasn't alone. Verse 7 reveals he had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had raised because she possessed neither father nor mother. The text describes her appearance. She was also called Esther, and she had an attractive figure and was beautiful. When both her parents died, Mordecai had adopted her as his own daughter. Here we encounter the girl destined to become queen. She was an orphan raised by her older cousin in a foreign land. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle, a tree indigenous to Israel that her forebears would have recognized. But she also carried a Persian name, Esther. This double identity would prove essential. Verse 8 tells us what transpired next. When the king's directive and edict had been announced, numerous young women were transported to the citadel of Susa and placed under Hegai's supervision. Esther was among them. She was taken to the king's palace and given over to Hegai, who had authority over the harem. Esther hadn't selected this path. She was taken from Mordecai's household, swept up in the king's search like all the other beautiful young women. The cousin who had raised her, who had provided her a home when her parents perished, could only watch as she vanished into the royal palace. All he could do was give her one essential instruction, and he ensured she grasped it fully. Verse 10 records this vital detail. Esther had not disclosed her nationality and family origins because Mordecai had commanded her not to do so. This wasn't a casual recommendation. This was a direct order from the man who had raised her, the man who comprehended what it meant to be Jewish in the Persian Empire. Whatever his motivations, whether he feared prejudice, danger, or simply wanted to shield her, Mordecai made it absolutely clear. Nobody in the palace could discover Esther was a Jew. So Hadassah became Esther entirely. The Jewish orphan girl buried her identity beneath her Persian name. In the harem, surrounded by women from throughout the empire, nobody knew her true identity or her actual origins. She was merely another beautiful face, another young woman awaiting her turn with the king. Verse 11 demonstrates that Mordecai didn't abandon her simply because she'd been taken into the palace. Every single day he paced back and forth near the harem courtyard to learn how Esther was faring and what was occurring with her. He couldn't see her directly or communicate with her, but he remained nearby. He observed. He waited. He maintained his connection to her, the only way available to him. Inside the palace walls, Esther was isolated with her secret. She couldn't discuss her family, her faith, or her people. She couldn't mention Mordecai or reveal who had raised her. She carried her authentic identity silently, concealed beneath her Persian name and her beautiful appearance. The girl who had lost her parents was now losing her past as well, burying it deep where nobody in the palace could uncover it. Something unanticipated happened to Esther in the harem. Chapter 2, verse 9 tells us that she won Hegai's approval and gained his favor. This carried significance because he was the king's eunuch, controlling the harem, the man who determined which women received optimal treatment, who understood the king's preferences. His favor could make a tremendous difference. Without delay, Haggai supplied Esther with beauty treatments and premium food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace, and he relocated her and her attendants into the finest quarters in the harem. In the palace, overflowing with beautiful women, all competing for the identical prize, Esther had just received every possible advantage. But why? The text doesn't indicate Esther requested special treatment or manipulated Haggai. It simply states she won his approval and gained his favor. Perhaps it was her character, how she interacted with others, or something genuine in her that distinguished her from all the calculated ambition surrounding her. Whatever the explanation, Haggai perceived something in this young woman that motivated him to assist her. Verse 10 reminds us once more, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Even while receiving preferential treatment, even after being moved to the best location in the harem, she remained silent about her true identity. The secret held firm. The beauty preparations were elaborate and extended. Verse 12 explains the procedure that every young woman had to complete before her opportunity to go to King Xerxes. 12 full months had to elapse. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. This wasn't simply about appearing beautiful. This was about transformation, about being prepared according to Persian standards until every trace of the girl's former existence was polished away. Verse 13 describes what occurred when the moment arrived for a young woman to go to the king. Anything she requested was provided to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. The women could ask for jewelry, special garments, or anything else they believed might capture the king's attention. It was their single opportunity to create an impression, so most took everything they could obtain. But verse 14 reveals the harsh reality. In the evening, each young woman would visit the king, and in the morning she would return to another section of the harem to the supervision of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who controlled the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was delighted with her and summoned her by name. One night, and then a lifetime of waiting in the secondary harem, hoping to hear your name called again, but understanding you probably never would. This was the reality Esther confronted. This was what awaited her after her 12 months of preparation concluded. One evening with a man she'd never encountered, and then the remainder of her life as a concubine in the second harem, unless she became queen. But only one woman would wear that crown. While Esther received her beauty treatments in the finest quarters in the harem, while she absorbed the customs of the Persian court with her 7 attendants, she watched and listened. She observed how the other women prepared, what they requested to take with them, how they attempted to distinguish themselves. And she learned something valuable from Haggai, the man who knew the king better than anyone else in the harem, the man who had witnessed countless women go to the king and return forgotten. Esther's silence regarding her identity had become her approach. She didn't call attention to herself. She didn't boast or scheme conspicuously like some of the others might have. She listened more than she talked. She paid careful attention to Haggai's guidance, and she waited for her opportunity, carrying her secret identity quietly through the months of preparation, never disclosing that beneath the Persian name and the beauty treatments was a Jewish orphan girl who should never have been in the palace at all. The 12 months elapsed. Verse 15 tells us that when Esther's turn arrived, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She requested nothing beyond what Haggai, the king's eunuch who supervised the harem, recommended. This was extraordinary. Every other young woman had taken whatever she desired, loading herself with jewelry and fine possessions to attract the king's attention. Esther took only what Haggai advised. She trusted the man who understood the king's tastes better than anyone. The verse continues, "And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. There was something about her that people responded to, something that transcended the beauty treatments and the elegant clothes. She had won Higgai's favor months earlier, and now she was winning the favor of everyone she met. Verse 16 provides us the timing. Esther was brought to King Xerxes in the royal residence during the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. 4 years had passed since Vashti had been removed from her position. 4 years since the throne beside the king had remained empty. Now this Jewish orphan girl, hiding her identity, was entering the king's presence. The text doesn't describe that night in specific detail. It doesn't reveal what they discussed or what transpired. Instead, verse 17 simply declares the outcome. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. The king loved her. Out of all the beautiful women gathered from across the empire, out of all those who had spent a year in beauty treatments and taken everything they could to impress him, Esther was the one who captured his heart. So he placed a royal crown on her head and made her queen in Vashti's place. The orphan had become royalty. The exile had become queen of the Persian Empire. The girl who had been taken from Mordecai's house against her will now occupied a throne beside the most powerful man in the known world. Verse 18 informs us the king hosted a magnificent banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal generosity. The empire celebrated its new queen. There were festivities, feasting, and rejoicing throughout the land. Everyone knew the king had found his queen, but nobody knew her true identity. Verse 19 mentions that when the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. This detail carries weight. The king's gate was where officials and important people congregated, where business was transacted, where those with some standing in the city would gather. Mordecai had positioned himself there, perhaps to stay as close to news of Esther as possible, perhaps because he had acquired some position or role that granted him access. But verse 20 reminds us once more of the secret that defined everything. Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had instructed her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's directions as she had done when he was bringing her up. Even as queen, even wearing the royal crown, even residing in the palace and married to the king, Esther still obeyed the man who had raised her. The secret remained intact. Nobody knew Queen Esther was Jewish. The girl who had lost everything, her parents, her freedom, her Jewish name, had gained everything the world could offer. But she remained obedient to Mordecai's command. She kept silent about her true identity. And that silence, that hidden heritage, would soon become the pivot point on which the fate of an entire nation would turn. Mordecai continued sitting at the king's gate, that location where officials gathered and palace business was handled. He was there so regularly, in fact, that he heard things most people wouldn't. And one day he heard something that would demonstrate his loyalty to the crown and preserve the king's life. Verse 21 establishes the scene. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became furious and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. These weren't random servants. These were men entrusted with the king's security, men who guarded the threshold and possessed access to him. Their position provided them the ideal opportunity to kill him. But verse 22 tells us their scheme didn't remain hidden. Mordecai discovered the conspiracy and informed Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, crediting Mordecai. This was how the information traveled, from Mordecai to Esther to the king. Mordecai couldn't approach the king directly, but he could reach Esther, and Esther could reach her husband. The connection between the orphan queen and her cousin who had raised her was still alive, still operating, even though it had to remain concealed. The king treated the report seriously. Verse 23 tells us what happened next. And when the report was investigated and discovered to be accurate, the two officials were impaled on poles. There was no clemency for traitors who attempted to kill the king. The punishment was swift and visible. The men who had been trusted to protect the king died on poles for everyone to witness. The verse concludes with an important detail. All this was documented in the Book of the Annals, in the presence of the king. Official records were maintained of everything significant that occurred in the kingdom. Court historians recorded the names, the events, the results. And somewhere in those royal chronicles was now an entry about Mordecai, the Jew who had exposed an assassination plot and saved the king's life. Mordecai had demonstrated his loyalty to King Xerxes. He had protected the throne. He had done precisely what any faithful subject should do upon discovering a conspiracy against their king. But curiously, the text doesn't mention any reward. There's no record of the king thanking Mordecai or honoring him or granting him a position or wealth. The entry was simply written in the Book of Chronicles, and life continued. Mordecai kept sitting at the king's gate. Esther kept her identity hidden in the palace. The record of Mordecai's good deed rested in the royal archives, waiting. Nobody realized that this moment, this uncelebrated act of loyalty, this entry in a book that nobody thought about, would become crucial at precisely the right time. The king didn't know it yet. Mordecai didn't know it yet. But that record was waiting like a seed planted in the ground, ready to sprout when the moment arrived. After these events, something shifted in the kingdom. Chapter 3, verse 1 introduces us to a new player. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. This wasn't a minor promotion. Haman was lifted above everyone else in the kingdom. Only the king himself ranked higher. The text specifically identifies Haman as the Agagite. This detail matters. The Agagites were descendants of Agag, the Amalekite king. The Amalekites had been enemies of Israel for centuries, going back to when the Israelites departed Egypt. King Saul had been commanded to destroy the Amalekites completely, but he had spared King Agag and lost his kingdom because of it. Now, generations later, a descendant of those ancient enemies occupied the highest position in the Persian Empire. Verse 2 tells us what the king commanded. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. Everyone was expected to bow. This wasn't simply respect. This was worship-like honor given to Haman whenever he passed. The king had ordered it, and everyone complied, everyone except one man. The verse continues. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Day after day, Mordecai sat at the king's gate and refused to bow when Haman walked by. He wouldn't kneel. He wouldn't honor this man. He simply remained as he was, while everyone else around him dropped to their knees. Verse 3 shows us that this didn't escape notice. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" They questioned him day after day about his refusal. This wasn't a one-time act of defiance. This was continuous, public, and impossible to overlook. Every single day, Mordecai refused to bow, and every day the other officials asked him why he was disobeying the king's direct order. Verse 4 tells us how this situation intensified. Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. Here we learn something crucial. Mordecai had revealed his identity to the officials at the gate. He had explained that he was a Jew. Whether this was his reason for not bowing or simply information he shared when pressed, the text doesn't specify. But now the officials knew, and they brought this information to Haman. Haman the Agagite, the descendant of Israel's ancient enemies, now knew that a Jew at the king's gate was refusing to honor him. The old hatred between their peoples, buried for generations, was about to surface in the Persian court. And this time the Agagite had all the power of the empire behind him. Verse 5 describes Haman's reaction. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. This wasn't mild annoyance or wounded pride. This was rage, deep, consuming anger at this one man's refusal to bow. Haman had been elevated above everyone in the kingdom. Everyone else showed him honor, but one Jew at the gate wouldn't kneel, and it consumed him. But verse 6 reveals something much darker. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Killing one man wasn't sufficient for Haman. His rage expanded beyond the individual who had insulted him to encompass an entire people. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. This was no longer about respect or honor. This was about genocide. Because one Jew refused to bow, Haman wanted every Jew in the empire dead. His anger had found a target large enough to match his wounded ego, an entire nation scattered throughout 127 provinces. He began looking for a way to accomplish this massive act of destruction. And so the threads came together. An orphan Jewish girl occupied the throne as queen, her identity hidden. Her cousin Mordecai sat at the king's gate, refusing to bow to the king's highest official. That official was a descendant of Israel's ancient enemies, now consumed with rage and planning something terrible. And none of them knew yet how these pieces would collide. The record of Mordecai's loyalty rested in the royal archives, unnoticed and unrewarded. Queen Esther lived in the palace following Mordecai's command to keep her nationality secret. Haman stood at the height of power, honored by everyone except the one man he hated most. The stage was set, the players were in position, and a plan was forming in Haman's mind that would force everyone to reveal their true identities and choose their loyalties. The rise of an orphan queen was complete. She had climbed from nothing to everything, from the lowest position imaginable to the throne of the greatest empire on earth. But she had no idea that her greatest test was approaching, that the hidden identity she carried would soon become the only thing standing between her people and total destruction. The crown on her head would mean nothing compared to the choice she would soon have to make. Haman didn't rush his plan. He wanted to choose the ideal day for what he was about to do. Chapter 3, verse 7 tells us, "In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. The pur was a form of divination, a method of determining fate by casting lots. Haman cast it over and over, day after day, month after month, looking for the most favorable time according to his superstitions and beliefs. He was treating this like a sacred act, consulting what he believed were the forces of fate to find the right moment for destruction. The lot kept being cast until it finally landed on a date, the 13th day of the 12th month. This gave Haman almost a full year, from the first month to the 12th month. Nearly 12 months stretched between the casting of the lot and the chosen day of destruction. It was a long time to wait, but Haman was patient. He believed fate had chosen this day, and he would use the time to make sure everything was perfectly arranged. The irony was thick. Haman was casting lots to determine when the Jews would die, trusting in chance and superstition to guide him. He thought he was controlling destiny, but he had no idea that the same providence he was trying to manipulate was already working against him, arranging pieces on a board he couldn't see. With his date chosen, Haman went to the king. Verse 8 records his carefully crafted pitch. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Notice what Haman did. He didn't say the Jews. He called them a certain people. He made them sound mysterious and dangerous. He claimed they kept themselves separate and had different customs. He accused them of not obeying the king's laws. He presented them as a threat to the kingdom, a problem that needed to be solved. And he framed it all in terms of the king's best interest. But Haman wasn't finished. Verse 9 shows his master stroke. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. This was an enormous sum of money, enough to fund armies, enough to make a king pay attention. Haman was essentially offering to purchase the destruction of the Jews, sweetening his proposal with a fortune. Where would Haman get this money? Most likely from plundering the Jews themselves after they were killed. He was betting that the wealth taken from an entire people spread across 127 provinces would more than cover his promised payment. It was a business transaction wrapped in genocide. Verse 10 tells us the king's response. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king didn't ask who these people were. He didn't investigate whether they really were a threat. He didn't question Haman's motives. He simply handed over his signet ring, the ultimate symbol of royal authority. With that ring, Haman could seal any decree and make it law. Verse 11 records what the king said, "Keep the money and do with the people as you please." The king was essentially telling Haman he didn't even need to pay. He trusted Haman completely. He gave him total authority over a certain people he couldn't be bothered to identify. With a few words and the transfer of a ring, the king had just authorized the destruction of an entire nation. He didn't know their name. He didn't care about their fate. He simply handed the power to Haman and went back to his wine. Haman moved quickly. Verse 12 describes what happened next. Then, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. This was official. This wasn't a secret plot or a quiet assassination. This was a public decree written in every language spoken in the empire, sent to every province, sealed with the king's authority. The machinery of the empire was being used to announce a massacre. Verse 13 tells us what the decree said. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Read those words again. Destroy, kill, and annihilate. Not just the men, not just the leaders or the troublemakers, all the Jews, young and old, women and children, every single one, in every province on the same day. It was systematic, total, and legal. And as a bonus, everyone was authorized to take their property. It was genocide with a profit motive. Verse 14 explains how the decree was distributed. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out at the king's command, and the decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. These weren't sealed secret orders. The decree was public. Everyone in every province was supposed to know about it. The 13th day of Adar was marked on the calendar. People had 11 months to prepare. The Jews had 11 months to dread what was coming. Their neighbors had 11 months to decide whether they would join the killing and take the plunder. The countdown to destruction had begun, and there was no way to stop it. Persian law was clear. Once a decree was sealed with the king's ring, it could never be revoked. Verse 15 gives us a stark contrast. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. While death sentences hung over an entire people, while fear spread through the Jewish community, while confusion gripped the city, the king and Haman celebrated. They sat down together with wine, satisfied with their day's work. Haman had gotten what he wanted. The king had handled a problem he didn't understand. and the Jews had been condemned to death by a law that couldn't be undone. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, chapter 4 verse 1 tells us his reaction. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. This was the traditional expression of devastating grief. Tearing clothes, wearing rough sackcloth instead of normal garments, covering yourself with ashes. These were how people showed that something terrible had happened. And Mordecai's wailing was loud. He wanted to be heard. Verse 2 says, "But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it." Even in his grief, there were rules. Mourning clothes couldn't enter the palace area. So Mordecai stood at the gate, as close as he could get to where Esther was, and mourned there. Verse 3 shows us this wasn't just Mordecai. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Across the entire empire, in all 127 provinces, wherever Jews lived, the same scene was playing out. They had read the decree. They knew they had been sentenced to death. They knew the date, and they mourned because there was nothing else they could do. But verse 4 reveals a problem. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. Esther was inside the palace, isolated from what was happening in the city. She didn't know about the decree. She only heard that Mordecai was at the gate wearing sackcloth. She had no idea why, so she sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Esther was trying to solve what she thought was a simple problem: get Mordecai proper clothes so he wouldn't be in mourning garments. She didn't understand. She was cut off from the crisis unfolding beyond the palace walls. The Queen of Persia had no idea that her people had just been condemned to death. Verse 5 tells us what Esther did next. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. She needed information. Something was clearly wrong, and she needed to know what it was. Verse 6 says, "So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. He found Mordecai and got the story." Verse 7 tells us what Mordecai shared. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. But Mordecai didn't just explain the situation. Verse 8 shows he gave Hathach something concrete. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Mordecai was clear about what needed to happen. Esther had to go to the king. She had to reveal her identity. She had to beg for her people. There was no other option. She was the only Jew with access to the king, the only one who might be able to change his mind. Verse 9 says, Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Now she knew. The decree existed. Her people were going to be killed. Mordecai wanted her to approach the king and plead for them. But verse 10 shows us Esther's response. She instructed him to say to Mordecai, verse 11, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." Esther was explaining her impossible situation. There was a law. Anyone who went to the king without being summoned faced automatic death. The only exception was if the king held out his golden scepter, but that was up to him. She couldn't control whether he would spare her or not. And she added a crucial detail. It had been 30 days since the king had called for her. She hadn't seen him in a month. Their relationship was clearly not as close as it once was. If she walked into his throne room unbidden, he might simply let her die. Verse 12 says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, He didn't accept her reasoning. Verse 13 gives us his response. He sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape." Mordecai was direct. He told her she wouldn't be safe just because she was queen. When the killing started, her hidden identity wouldn't protect her forever. Verse 14 continues his message: "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" These words would echo through history. Mordecai was telling Esther that God would save the Jews somehow, even if she did nothing. But if she stayed silent, she and her family would die anyway. And then he asked the question that defined everything. What if this was why she became queen? What if her whole journey, from orphan to palace to throne, was for this exact moment? What if she was exactly where she needed to be, when she needed to be there, with the access and position required to save her people? Verse 15 tells us, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai," verse 16, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther had made her decision. She would go to the king. But first, she needed 3 days. 3 days of fasting. No food, no water, day or night. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. This was serious preparation. In that culture, fasting was connected to prayer and seeking God's help in desperate situations. Esther was asking all the Jews in Susa to fast with her. She and her attendants would do the same. And then she spoke the words that defined her courage: "If I perish, I perish." She was going in knowing she might die. She wasn't confident in her beauty or her relationship with the king. She was simply choosing to act, whatever the cost. Better to die trying to save her people than to die hiding while they were slaughtered. Verse 17 says, "So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions." The fasting began. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Jews of Susa abstained from all food and water. Esther and her attendants did the same inside the palace. They were preparing for the moment when she would walk into the throne room unbidden and uninvited, gambling her life on the king's response. Those 3 days must have felt endless. Every hour that passed brought Esther closer to the moment of truth. Would the king extend his scepter or let her die? Would he be angry at her interruption or pleased to see her? She had no way of knowing. She could only prepare, fast, pray, and then walk forward into whatever waited for her. Chapter 5, verse 1 tells us, "On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. The 3 days were over. Esther dressed in her finest clothes and took her position in the inner court where the king could see her. She stood there, waiting to see if she would live or die." Verse 2 gives us the moment everything hung on. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. She lived. The king was pleased to see her. He extended the scepter. Esther could approach. She walked forward and touched the tip of the golden staff, the symbol that she had been granted permission to live and speak. Verse 3 shows the king was more than just tolerant. He was generous. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." This was the traditional royal formula, a way of saying he would grant her a significant favor. The king was in a good mood. He wanted to please his queen. He was ready to give her almost anything she wanted. This was the moment Esther could have spoken immediately. She could have told him about Haman's plot, revealed her identity, begged for her people. But verse 4 shows she did something unexpected. "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." She didn't ask for what she really wanted. Instead, she invited the king and Haman to dinner. She was buying time, setting a scene, creating the perfect moment for her real request. Verse 5 tells us, "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. The king agreed immediately. He called for Haman, and they both went to Esther's banquet. Verse 6 tells us, as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." The king was enjoying himself. He asked again what Esther wanted, renewing his promise. But verse 7 shows Esther still wasn't ready to reveal everything. Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this." Verse 8, "If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Another delay, another banquet, another day. Esther was extending the tension, waiting for exactly the right moment. The king agreed. They would come back tomorrow. Verse 9 tells us Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. He had just been invited again to a private banquet with the king and queen. Only him, no other nobles. It was the highest honor imaginable. But then his mood crashed. The verse continues, "But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai." There was Mordecai, still at the gate, still refusing to stand or bow, still showing no fear, and all of Haman's happiness evaporated into rage. Verse 10 says, "Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. He controlled his anger long enough to leave. When he got home," verse 10 continues, "he called together his friends and Zeresh, his wife." Verse 11 tells us what he did. Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. Haman listed everything he had: his money, his children, his promotions, his position. He was trying to remind himself of how great he was. Verse 12 continues his boasting. "And that's not all," Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow." He was the only one invited to these private dinners with the king and queen. It was the ultimate sign of favor. But verse 13 reveals the poison in his soul. "But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Everything Haman had meant nothing because one man wouldn't bow. All his wealth, all his honor, all his access to power, none of it satisfied him because Mordecai still sat at that gate in defiance. Verse 14 gives us the solution proposed by his wife and friends. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. 50 cubits was about 75 feet high, a massive structure that everyone in the city would see. Haman loved the idea. He would ask the king in the morning for permission to execute Mordecai on this pole, and then the problem would be solved. He could enjoy the banquet knowing his enemy was dead. So Haman had the pole built that night, ready for Mordecai. But verse 1 of chapter 6 introduces a problem Haman knew nothing about. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the Book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. The king had insomnia. He couldn't sleep. So he asked for the official records to be read aloud, probably hoping the boring lists would help him drift off. Verse 2 tells us what happened. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. The reader happened to land on the entry about Mordecai saving the king's life. Of all the events in all the records, this was the one being read that sleepless night. Verse 3 shows the king's response. "What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" the king asked. "Nothing has been done for him," his attendants answered. The king discovered that the man who saved his life had never been rewarded. This was a problem. Kings were supposed to honor those who showed loyalty. The fact that nothing had been done for Mordecai was embarrassing. Verse 4 tells us, "The king said, 'Who is in the court?'" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. The timing was perfect and terrible. The king was thinking about how to honor Mordecai, and at that exact moment, Haman walked in planning to ask permission to kill him. Verse 5 continues, "His attendants answered, 'Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in,' the king ordered." The stage was set for a collision that Haman couldn't have anticipated. He thought he was walking in to get approval for an execution. He had no idea the king had just been reading about Mordecai's loyalty. He had no idea what question was about to be asked. When Haman came in, verse 6 of chapter 6 tells us, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" His ego answered the question before he even considered other possibilities. Obviously, the king was talking about him. Who else would deserve such honor? So verse 7 shows us Haman's answer. Haman answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor." Verse 8, "Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head." Haman was thinking big. He wanted the king's own robe, the actual garment that had been on the king's body. He wanted the king's horse with the royal crest, symbols that would make him look almost like royalty himself. But he wasn't finished. Verse 9 continues his proposal. "Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Haman wanted a full parade. He wanted to be dressed in royal clothes, riding the royal horse, led through the streets by one of the highest princes, while someone announced his honor to everyone watching. Verse 10 records the king's response. "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Mordecai the Jew, the man at the gate who refused to bow. The man Haman had built a 75-foot pole to execute. That Mordecai. The king wanted Haman to do everything he had just described, but for his worst enemy, and Haman himself would have to be the one to honor him. Verse 11 tells us what happened next. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Every single step was agony for Haman. He had to dress Mordecai in the king's robe with his own hands. He had to place him on the king's horse. He had to walk in front of that horse through the streets of Susa and shout the exact proclamation he had designed for himself. Everyone who saw the parade knew what was happening. They could see that Mordecai, the Jew who refused to bow to Haman, was being honored by the king. And they could see Haman, serving as his herald, walking in front and announcing Mordecai's honor to the entire city. The reversal was public and complete. When the parade finally ended, verse 12 tells us, "Afterward Mordecai returned to the king's gate." Mordecai simply went back to his usual spot. He didn't let the honor change him or inflate his ego. He returned to where he always sat, resuming his normal position as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He remained himself. But Haman's reaction was completely different. The verse continues, But Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. Covering the head was a traditional sign of deep shame and mourning. Haman couldn't stay in public after what had just happened. He couldn't face the people who had watched him honor his enemy. He fled to his house, devastated and humiliated, his head covered to show his distress. Verse 13 shows us what happened when he got there and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. He recounted the entire terrible experience, how he had to honor Mordecai, how the parade went, how everything had turned against him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." His own family and closest friends saw what was coming. This wasn't just a bad day or a temporary setback. This was the beginning of Haman's complete destruction. And they told him directly, "You're going down. You can't win against this Jew. Your downfall has already started." Verse 14 tells us, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. Haman didn't even have time to process what had happened or recover from his humiliation. The king's servants rushed into his house and took him away immediately. He was being hurried to the queen's second banquet, walking straight from his worst moment into what would become his final meal. Chapter 7, verse 1 tells us, "So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. They sat down to eat and drink together. The king was relaxed, enjoying the wine and the private company of just his queen and his highest official." Verse 2 continues, "And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, 'Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted.'" For the third time now, the king asked Esther what she wanted. He renewed his generous promise. He was ready to give her whatever she requested, up to half of his entire kingdom. This was the moment Esther had been preparing for. She had delayed twice, but now the time had come. Verse 3 records her answer. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request." The words hung in the air. Grant me my life. The Queen of Persia was asking the king to let her live. She was telling him she was under a death sentence. And not just her. Her people were condemned as well. The king had no idea what she was talking about. Verse 4 explains why this was so urgent and serious. "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Esther laid it all out clearly. She and her people had been sold for complete destruction. She made it very clear this wasn't about slavery or some minor oppression. This was about total extermination, being destroyed, killed, and annihilated. She even said that if it were just slavery, she wouldn't have bothered the king about it. Verse 5 gives us the king's shocked reaction. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" The king was stunned. Someone had dared to threaten the queen's life. Someone had planned to destroy her people. He demanded to know immediately who would dare to do this. Verse 6 records Esther's direct answer. Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." She pointed straight at him, the man sitting right there at the banquet table, the man the king had elevated above everyone else in the kingdom, the man the king trusted completely. Haman was the one who had planned all of this. The verse ends with Haman's reaction. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Everything had just collapsed around him. The king now knew that the certain people he had authorized Haman to destroy included his own wife. The queen herself was one of them. And Haman sat there at the table, completely exposed and terrified, knowing his life was finished. Verse 7 tells us, the king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. The king's fury was too much to contain in that room. He needed to think. He needed air. He needed to process what he had just learned, that he had authorized the death of his own wife. So he walked out into the garden, leaving Haman alone with Esther. The verse continues, but Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Haman knew exactly what the king's rage meant. He knew he was finished. His only possible chance now was to plead with Esther. Maybe she would show mercy. Maybe she would ask the king to spare him. It was his last, desperate hope. Verse 8 describes what happened next. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. In his complete desperation, Haman had thrown himself toward where Esther was, begging for his life. But the timing couldn't have been worse. The king walked back in at that exact moment and saw Haman over his wife. The king exploded in fury. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" The king interpreted what he saw as an assault on the queen, happening right in front of him in his own palace. Haman's position looked completely wrong at the worst possible moment. The verse ends with devastating finality. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. The servant standing nearby immediately covered Haman's face with a cloth. This was the traditional sign of condemnation in the Persian court. When someone's face was covered in the king's presence, it meant they were sentenced to death. There would be no trial, no defense, no second chances, no mercy. Haman was done. Verse 9 introduces one of the servants. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Harbona helpfully mentioned the gallows that Haman had built, the massive structure 75 feet tall that stood at Haman's house. And he made sure the king knew exactly who it was meant for. Mordecai, the man who had saved the king's life by exposing the assassination plot. The king's response was immediate and decisive. The verse continues. The king said, "Impale him on it." There was no hesitation, no investigation, no discussion. The king simply ordered Haman to be executed on the very gallows he had built for someone else. Verse 10 tells us the outcome. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. The reversal was complete and poetic. The execution device that Haman had constructed to display Mordecai's dead body now displayed his own. The man who had cast lots to destroy all the Jews died on the instrument of death he had personally prepared for a single Jew. Only then, after Haman was dead, did the king's anger finally cool down. But there was a major problem that Haman's death didn't solve. The decree to destroy all the Jews was still in effect. It was still sealed with the king's signet ring. It was still scheduled to happen on the 13th day of Adar. And according to the unchangeable laws of Persia and Media, it couldn't be revoked. Haman was dead, but his genocide was still completely legal and supposedly unstoppable. Chapter 8 verse 1 tells us, that same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. On the same day Haman died, his entire estate was given to Esther, and Esther finally revealed publicly her connection to Mordecai. He was her cousin, the man who had raised her as his own daughter. Mordecai was brought before the king and given direct access to his presence. Verse 2 continues, the king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. The ring that had sealed the death decree was now in Mordecai's hands. He was elevated immediately to Haman's former position as the highest official in the kingdom. Everything Haman had owned, his house, his wealth, his property, now belonged to Esther, and she put Mordecai in charge of it all. The reversal of fortune was dramatic and swift. But Esther wasn't satisfied with just this. Verse 3 shows her falling at the king's feet again. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Haman was dead, but his evil plan was still alive and active. The decree was still law. The Jews were still condemned to die. Esther needed the king to do something about it. Verse 4 tells us, "Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him." Once again, just like the first time she approached him unbidden, the king showed her favor. He extended the scepter. He was willing to listen to what she had to say. Verse 5 records Esther's carefully worded request. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces." Esther asked for a new decree to cancel out Haman's order. She wanted the death sentence lifted from her people. Verse 6 shows the emotion behind her request. "For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" She couldn't just stand by and watch her people be slaughtered. She couldn't stay silent knowing her family and everyone like her would be destroyed. But there was a serious legal problem. Verses 7 and 8 give us the king's response. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name on behalf of the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." The king explained the reality of Persian law. It was absolutely permanent and unchangeable. Once a decree was sealed with the king's signet ring, it couldn't be cancelled or revoked, not by anyone, not even by the king himself. But the king gave them a solution. Write a new decree. They couldn't erase or cancel the first law, but they could create a second law to work against it. Verse 9 tells us what happened immediately. At once the royal secretaries were summoned on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. Mordecai took charge of the situation. He dictated the new decree in every language spoken across the empire, including Hebrew, specifically for the Jewish communities. The message would go to all 127 provinces, just like Haman's death decree had been sent everywhere. Verse 11 gives us the critical content of this new decree. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. This was brilliant legal strategy. The first decree said that everyone in the empire could attack and kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar. This second decree said that the Jews had the legal right to defend themselves and fight back with full force. They could gather together. They could organize and prepare. They could kill anyone who attacked them. They could even take the property of their enemies. Verse 17 describes the response across the empire. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. The mood among the Jewish people changed completely and immediately. They went from mourning and despair to celebration and hope. They had been given a real fighting chance to survive. And something very interesting happened. Many non-Jews decided to convert to Judaism. They saw what was coming and calculated that it was much safer to be counted among the Jews than against them. Fear of what the Jews might do on the 13th of Adar made people seriously reconsider their loyalties. Chapter 9 verse 1 brings us to the actual day. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The day finally arrived. Both decrees were officially in effect simultaneously, but everything had completely reversed from what Haman had planned. The enemies who had been planning to attack and plunder the Jews found themselves facing organized, prepared, and legally authorized Jewish resistance. Verse 2 tells us, the Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those who sought to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. The Jews gathered together in their communities and fought back, and they were successful. People throughout the empire were afraid to attack them because everyone knew the Jews now had the full backing and support of the king himself. Verse 5 describes what happened. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. This was complete victory. The Jews defeated everyone who came against them. Verses 7 through 10 give us specific details. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. All 10 of Haman's sons were killed in the fighting. Every single one of them died. But notice the important detail that's repeated. The Jews did not take the plunder. Even though the decree gave them legal permission to take their enemy's property, they chose not to do it. This wasn't about getting rich or taking revenge for material gain. This was purely about survival and justice. Verse 16 summarizes what happened throughout the empire. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. Throughout all the provinces, 75,000 enemies were killed. The number shows how widespread and serious the threat against the Jews had been. But once again, the text emphasizes the same point. They did not take any plunder. This phrase is repeated multiple times throughout the chapter to make it absolutely clear. The Jews weren't motivated by greed or a desire for wealth. Verse 20 tells us, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far. Mordecai made sure to write down everything that had happened. He wanted the complete story preserved. He sent official letters to Jewish communities everywhere, across the vast empire, both near and far from the capital. Verse 21 continues, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar. Mordecai established these days as an official holiday that should be celebrated every single year. This wasn't meant to be a one-time celebration. It was to become a permanent part of Jewish life. Verse 22 explains the reason for this celebration, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. This was the heart of why they should celebrate, because of the complete reversal of their situation. They went from deep sorrow to overwhelming joy, from mourning certain death to celebrating miraculous deliverance, from facing total destruction to experiencing complete victory. And Mordecai specified exactly how they should celebrate, with feasting and joy, by sharing food with each other, and by giving gifts to poor people who needed help. Verse 26 tells us where the holiday's name came from. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The holiday was named Purim after the pur, the lot that Haman had cast to choose the day of destruction. The very method he used to plan their death became the name of their celebration of life. It was a permanent reminder that what was meant for evil was turned into good. Verse 28 emphasizes the permanence of this observance. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. The command was absolutely clear. Never forget what happened. Every generation must remember. Every family must observe it. Every city and province where Jews lived must celebrate. The days of Purim should never stop being celebrated, and the memory of these events must never die out or fade away among future generations. Chapter 10, verse 3, gives us the final summary of how things ended. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. This was the conclusion. The orphan girl who had lost her parents became the queen of the most powerful empire on earth. The exile who refused to bow to evil became second only to the king in authority. The people who were marked for complete destruction became the people who defeated all their enemies. The day that was chosen for their annihilation became the day of their deliverance and victory. And the lots that were cast to seal their doom gave their celebration its name, Purim, the festival that forever remembers when everything reversed, when the plan meant for evil was turned into something good, and when courage in the face of certain death ended up saving an entire nation. If this story impacted you the way it impacted me, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they're facing their own impossible choice. Maybe they need to be reminded that one person's courage can change everything. The story of Esther isn't just ancient history. It's a reminder that you might be exactly where you need to be for such a time as this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.